Well, let's say a very good afternoon to Rakib Ehsan, who's our good friend from the Henry Jackson Society. Rakib, very good afternoon to you.
Morning, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, we're good. I mean, we've had some funny conversations, you and I, Rakib, over the years that we've known each other. This, perhaps, the most bizarre we are about to have, where the police are looking at dropping the terms Islamist terrorism and jihadi. I mean, what on earth are they thinking?
Well, Mike, I've said many times before, there's no room for this kind of virtue signaling behavior when it comes to counterterrorism. So you've listed there a group, you could say, of Islamist inspired terrorist attacks. And it's very important that we have clarity over these attacks because it's very important that we factor in and understand the ideological motivations. Now, if people are looking to obscure the facts surrounding terrorist attacks which take place on British soil, that's only going to undermine public trust in the police and counter extremism agencies, and that is not what we want at all.
No, exactly right. I mean, their argument, of course, is because this has come as a suggestion from the National Association of Muslim Police, which I must confess I didn't realise existed until this moment. But you can see what they're doing here. What they're basically saying is that when there's a terrorist attack which is by someone other than a Muslim terrorist, they don't kind of give it any kind of Christian tag, or they don't call it anything to do with the Crusades. But I mean, the IRA bombing campaign was not blamed on the Catholic Church. I get that, but these people are doing this in the name of Allah. They're doing it in the name of the Muslim deity. They're doing it in the name of Islam as a religion. Now, whether or not you accept that, that's what they're saying they're doing it in.
Well, Mike, I'd make the point that in my own research, I have referred to attacks as Christian fundamentalist terrorist attacks. So, firstly, I don't accept that point that has been made. The reality of the matter is we have various strands and various types of terrorism which are motivated by different ideological sources.
Right.
And I think it's important if we're looking at, say, designing and formulating counter ideologies, so counter narratives, anti-extremist counter narratives, you need to be clear and you need to be honest about the ideological motivations behind various kinds of terrorism. So I think this is a deeply unhelpful development. Some of the labels which are being suggested include faith claim terrorism, terrorists abusing religious motivations, adherents of Osama bin Laden's ideology.
Right.
Now, quite frankly, this is just trying to deflect attention away from what are Islamist-inspired terrorist attacks.
Right.
And I think it's very important that we have a degree of transparency here when we're dealing with various kinds of terrorist attacks. I do feel, unfortunately, this is where identity politics is now it's almost infecting thinking within public institutions.
Well, exactly.
And I think that,
I mean, is this something that they're frightened of using? I mean, is the feared backlash so much now from the Muslim community and from Muslim organisations that the police are actually terrified of saying what they want to say? Because we hear all the time, for example, with the attack in Reading, with the attack in Streatham, with the secondary attack on London Bridge, that basically these were not somehow Islamist terrorists, that they were kind of, lone wolf terrorists, as if they didn't want to link the Muslim religion with these attacks.
Mike, I would really make the point here that we had a lecturer at University of Huddersfield, Rizwan Mustafa, saying that we shouldn't even attribute attacks to Islamic State. Now, I think that the reality of the matter is what we are seeing. We're seeing the virus of identity politics now infecting public institutions. And I think it's deeply unhelpful. I think that we need to be honest and we need to be open about the ideological sources of terrorist attacks which take place on British soil. The reality of the matter is the prevailing terrorism threat is from Islamist extremism. Right. We should not hide it. We should not be trying to couch it in language which, quite frankly, identitarian leftists are suggesting. I think that we need to be robustly open and we need to be transparent about these kinds of matters.
Yeah.
Because the reality of the matter is, Mike, if you start obscuring the facts surrounding these kind of terrorist attacks, the mainstream British public are going to see it. And that's only going to intensify forms of anti-authority sentiment in the mainstream British public. And I do not see that as a welcome development at all.
No, not at all, because the British public are not stupid, and the British public, who speak to me on many an occasion, either through this radio station or through social media, will always say to me, why is it that this particular terrorist attack has not been linked with Islam, when the guy who stabbed people just before he stabbed them shouted Allahu Akbar? And what's wrong with saying that? What's wrong with admitting that? It doesn't mean that all Muslims, therefore, are in some way to be feared. It doesn't mean that the Muslim culture is violent because one person has done something violent. It doesn't mean any of that, but you can't hide it either.
Mike, I've always made the point that there is no such thing as a British Muslim community.
Right.
There's a great deal of diversity within the broader British Muslim population. Unfortunately, I think there are bodies which I would describe as identitarian leftist associations who are vocal. They're a strong voice. In my view, all too often they're given a disproportionate amount of attention. And it's important that those kind of bodies, they do not seize control of narratives surrounding issues of extremism and terrorism.
Right.
So I think ultimately that is not productive at all, because when we are dealing with terrorist attacks, we're dealing with extremist ideologies, we need to be open and honest about the content of those ideologies, what are motivating those terrorist attacks. If you're looking to essentially pander to identitarian leftists, that will be deeply problematic from a counter-extremism perspective, because what you will also see then, you will see far-right organizations, they will capitalize and exploit that, and they will peddle anti-establishment narratives that, unfortunately, there are people who may be vulnerable to falling, essentially buying into those narratives. And when you see things like this, it provides ammunition to people in British society that you don't really want to be empowering. But unfortunately, this could backfire spectacularly, Mike.
Well, I think so, yeah. And that's the other problem that we see here, because if you start to sort of misname things and you start to ignore terms, suddenly you're no longer looking for that type of terrorism. So you're suddenly, in your quest to stop it from happening, you're actually missing the point.
I agree. I could not agree more. I think that ultimately, when it comes to terrorism-related activity, often is the case there are religious motivations involved, and if you're looking to hide that, unfortunately, I think that's deeply problematic from a counter-extremism perspective. I think you need to be honest, you need to be clear about the ideological sources of terrorism and terrorism-related activity which takes place on British soil. And I just feel that all too often we have public institutions now, it's almost like that they prioritize virtue signaling behavior over being honest, over the reality that this country, when it comes to terrorism-related activity, the primary threat that the UK faces is from Islamist extremism, and we need to be open and honest about that. And I've seen people say that, Muslims who are involved in counter-extremism, they're uncomfortable with the term Islamism, they're uncomfortable with the term jihadi. The reality of the matter is, these kind of identitarian leftist associations, they don't speak for me, Mike.
No,
I can tell you that right now.
Exactly
and
right.
I think they should be very careful when they come to try to homogenize the British Muslim population, which is deeply diverse, and there's a diversity of opinions when it comes to issues of terrorism and extremism.
Yeah, because they're not slow in sort of naming far-right terrorism as the cause of something. And in fact, I think, was it not Scotland Yard themselves who came out with a report not that many months ago, which said that far-right terrorism was very much on the rise and it was a very dangerous thing. And everyone's kind of standing around staring at each other going, well, what are they talking about? Why are they making out that far-right terrorism is a massive problem? When, yes, it's a problem, but it's not a massive problem.
Well, I think I'd make the point that Neil Basu himself, what he said was that far-right extremism is the fastest growing terror threat.
Right.
There's a big difference, as you know, and a lot of people are confused by it, which doesn't say much for the mental arithmetic.
Yeah, but he knew what he was doing.
Fastest growing is very different to what is the primary threat. The primary threat very much remains Islamist extremism.
Right.
And I think if you're going to be willing to talk about white supremacist, neo-Nazi sources of terrorism-related activity, also be honest about Islamist extremist sources of terrorism-related activity. Because I think it's important that we have these discussions in an open and transparent manner.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Speaking of Islamic terrorist threats, let's talk a little bit finally about Shamima Begum, because you and I spoke about it, of course, last week. I was saying over the weekend that it's surprising to hear nothing from Keir Starmer about the old Shamima Begum case. Lisa Nandy, of course, was on TV over the weekend saying that she's very much our problem, somebody that we should be bringing back to this country to challenge her stripping of her citizenship. Starmer, of course, last year was very much of that opinion. I suspect he's still of that opinion, which I presume is why he's not voicing it.
Well, I've said it before, Mike. I think when it comes to the victimhood narrative surrounding Shamima Begum, there have been too many politicians on the left, especially within the Labour Party, who have been more than happy to indulge in those kind of narratives that Shamima Begum is somehow a victim, she was groomed, she was exploited. Yeah, these are the same politicians that will put Greta Thunberg on a pedestal,
Right.
you know, as a commanding authority on issues, environmental issues. These are also politicians who have history of supporting the voting age being lowered to 16, which is not too much higher than the age that Shamima Begum was when she ran off to join a genocidal terrorist organization in the form of Islamic State.
Yeah.
So I think there's a great deal of hypocrisy on the left, and it needs to be called out. It needs to be challenged. And to be honest, when you see Labour politicians bending over backwards for Shamima Begum, it does reinforce the image of the Labour Party being an anti-British institution, and I think that's a huge problem. If they're looking to win back those voters that they lost in the Red Wall, I have to say, so far under Starmer's leadership, they're not doing a very good job if they are looking to win back those voters.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Dr. Rakib Ehsan, thank you very much indeed. Centre on Radicalisation and Terrorism at the Henry Jackson Society.